The most powerful creatures in the game aren't always the most expensive, but rather the cheapest to cast. One-drop creatures have always been a game changer ever since the very beginning. However, you may wonder, out of the hundreds of one-drops, which creatures impacted the game the most. In this video, we will cover those exact cards, so let's go ahead and take a look at the greatest one-drop creatures the game has ever seen. We're going to get straight to the point. The greatest one-drop creature in the history of Magic is the one and only Birds of Paradise. You're probably wondering why. Well, it's simple. This 0/1 flying creature can produce any colored mana. That alone allows you to be able to play with practically any amount of colors in your deck. Also, the fact you can start casting 3 drops on turn 2 and accelerate into higher amounts of mana gives you an advantage right out of the gate. It's not only what this card can do that makes it the best, but it's also what it has done. Birds of Paradise have been in numerous tournament-winning decks from the beginning of competitive play, including multiple World Championships and Pro Tours. The Birds have also seen several versions of its artwork changed over the years. After the original Birds, there was the 7th edition version, and several years later was the Ravnica version. After that came a promo version, and finally, the latest iteration is the Secret Lair version. However, the last time Birds of Paradise was printed in Standard was in Magic Core Set 2012, which was released in 2011. Of course, there are other cards that play just like the famous birds. There was Landlore Elves, which was mentioned in our last video, and Noble Hierarch, which in some cases is considered to be more powerful than the birds because of its exalted ability. Another green creature worth mentioning is Wild Nacatl. This 1/1 for 1 green mana has the ability to grow to a 2/2 if you control a plains or a mountain on the battlefield, and if you control both, then it becomes a 3/3. This cat was a prominent creature during the days of Shards of Alara back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, primarily in formats such as Extended and Legacy. It's mostly because you can get it to attack for 3 by turn 2 thanks to fetch lands and dual lands. In fact, it won a Pro Tour in an extended format deck called Zoo, piloted by Hall of Famer Brian Kibler. Later, Zoo with Wild Nacatl would dominate the modern format to the point where it was banned shortly after the format was introduced. However, it would later prove not to be as powerful as they once thought, so it was unbanned 3 years later in 2014. Speaking of Zoo, the original Zoo 1-drop was none other than Kurdate. Printed in Arabian Nights in 1994, this 1/1 for 1 red mana gets an additional 1/2 if you control a forest on the battlefield. Back in the mid-90s, the rate on this card was very good. It even almost won the very first World Championship, finishing in 2nd in 1994. Because of its rate, Kurdate actually scared Wizards of the Coast to the point where they stopped reprinting the card after 3rd edition and banned it in the extended format in 1997. However, that changed because the ape was finally reprinted again in 9th edition and is now playable in all formats. Next up, we have one of the most successful one-drop red creatures, Monastery Swiftspear. For 1 red mana, you get a 1/2 with haste and prowess. Released in Khans of Tarkir, the Swiftspear immediately had notoriety, but it wasn't until several months later when the Magic community started seeing red-based decks running Monastery Swiftspear winning tournaments. Of course, there are others to consider like Soulscar Mage and Grim Lavamancer. However, red is all about speed and burn, and nothing else does that better than the Swiftspear from Tarkir. Before we move on to our next color, we have to mention Mogg Fanatic. This card was one of the most dominant one-drop creatures back in its heyday. For 1 red mana, you get a 1/1 goblin that has the ability, Sacrifice Mogg Fanatic, to deal 1 damage to any target. The reason this card was one of the most notorious one-drops was from a now discontinued ruling called Damage on the Stack. Damage on the Stack was a complicated interaction involving attacking and blocking creatures. It occurs when an attacking and blocking creature assigns combat damage. After combat damage is assigned, the damage would be locked in and put onto the stack. This would then allow any player to cast instant speed spells or activate abilities before the combat damage would resolve. No matter the outcome, the assigned damage resolves even when the creatures have died. This often resulted in the Mogg Fanatic being able to have his damage from combat resolve while also sacrificing itself to deal another damage from its ability. Because of this, the Fanatic was very versatile, as it could trade with a 2 toughness creature or 2 1 toughness creatures, and it also can deal an immediate 1 direct damage the turn it enters the battlefield. Speaking of damage, there is no deck that wants to deal as much damage to itself as quickly as possible than Death's Shadow. For 1 black mana, you get a 13/13 that gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. The strategy was to play fetch lands into shock lands while casting spells like Gitaxian Probe and Thoughtseize to inflict life loss on yourself. This would allow Death's Shadow to grow in power and toughness. Then once Death's Shadow is large enough, attack the opponent and cast Temur Battle Rage to give it double strike and trample. This one swing would be more than enough to finish the opponent. If not, there were other cheap pump spells such as Mutagenic Growth and Become Immense to buff up the shadow even more. No deck took life loss to extreme heights and was consistently successful, quite like Death's Shadow, which makes it one of the most impactful one-drop black creatures the game has ever seen. Next up is White, with Mother of Runes. This card from Urza's Legacy saw immediate success because it was very versatile thanks to the ability to give protection from any color to any target creature, including itself. With the Mother in play, you had an unbeatable blocker, a creature nearly impossible to kill, and you could make any single attacker unblockable, all thanks to her giving protection of any color until end of turn. Seeing this played on turn 1 was bad news for the opponent because if they didn't have an answer by your next turn, it would be extremely difficult to get rid of her. To this day, Mother of Runes still sees play in Eternal formats such as Legacy and Vintage. It even has a pseudo-functional reprint in Modern in the form of Giver of Runes. Before we move on to the next color, we have to briefly mention one of the most underrated white 1-drops the game has ever seen. Released in Shadows over Innistrad, Thraben Inspector costs 1 white mana for a 1/2 with the ability Investigate. This 1/2 for 1 is the epitome of cheap, incremental value as you get an efficient creature plus a clue token that could be used at any time to draw a card even when Thraben Inspector isn't in play. This innocuous 1-drop saw immediate play in Standard the moment it was available to the very last day it rotated out. The last card we'll mention could also be up for debate for the most powerful 1-drop creature ever printed. For 1 blue mana, you get Delver of Secrets, a 1/1 human that has the trigger ability that says, during your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. If it is an instant or sorcery card, transform it into a 3/2 flying insectile aberration. Transforming Delver may seem a little hard to do, however, blue-based Delver decks always had more than enough instant and sorcery spells to transform it, usually by the following turn. This would give them a 3/2 flyer, attacking on turn 2, and since they're playing blue, there would be more than enough spells to protect the aberration all the way to the very last swing. An incredibly powerful creature, Delver of Secrets took a couple of months before players started seeing its potential. From that moment, the human scientist from Innistrad became one of the most powerful blue creatures the game has ever seen. And that, my friends, was our episode of Cards That Changed the Game. We may have omitted some great 1-drops, but we could not cover them all. If you believe a card should have been mentioned, please let us know by leaving a comment. This was Jonathan Beach voicing this video. We will have another episode soon. We are thinking it will either be Goblins, the Lorwyn 5, or Sacrifice. Let us know which one you'd like to see next by leaving a comment. We hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.